They had so much evidence that legally they were required to notify Malcolm X that there was a threat to his life. The US government hated Malcolm X and they wanted him silenced. However, he was one of the most well-known members of an organization called the NOI. While in prison, Malcolm began receiving letters from his brothers telling him about a new organization that they joined called the Nation of Islam, and that the Nation of Islam was all about helping and uplifting Black Americans. So he decided to write a letter to the Nation of Islam's leader at the time, a man named Elijah Muhammad. Elijah helps Malcolm with understanding himself and his relationship to God. So Malcolm goes to Chicago, where the Nation of Islam's headquarters was at the time, I believe, to meet Elijah. They developed a father and son relationship. They were very close. Almost anyone who heard Malcolm speak was so moved and inspired that they became a member of the NOI. In 1957, Hinton Johnson, who was the member of the NOI in Harlem, where Malcolm was the leader, was walking down the street with two other members of the NOI when they run into a group of police officers, beating an unarmed Black man. When Hinton sees this, he yells to the police officers, "Hey, this is not Alabama, this is New York City." And then the police officers arrest all of the Black men who were there. A bystander who was there saw everything that went down and went to go and tell Malcolm. And Malcolm goes with a group of people, like him and 5 people, go down to the police station and they demand to see the members of the NOI who have been arrested. After a while, word goes around town about what's going on and people start showing up to the police station to support Malcolm. After about 500 people show up outside of the police station, the police are like, oh shoot, okay, all right, fine, we have him, you can see him. And when Malcolm goes outside, all he does is one hand movement and the crowd falls silent and then they just silently disperse. The police were terrified. When they witnessed this, they were like, oh my God, they were so shook. The story made national news and the American public became aware of who Malcolm X was. So the FBI began heavily surveying Malcolm after this. They were tapping his phones, they were tracking his location constantly. The FBI learns that Malcolm and Elijah are no longer seeing things eye to eye. They're not getting along too well. Firstly, Malcolm disagreed about the way that Elijah was running the organization. He felt that they could be doing more to support and uplift the members. Malcolm also disagreed with how political Elijah had become. He became way more concerned with the image of the NOI rather than actually uplifting and helping Black Americans. The last reason that Elijah and Malcolm weren't seeing eye to eye, and probably the most shocking reason, Malcolm discovers that Elijah has been having extramarital affairs with some of his very young secretaries, and he's fathered children with some of them. On December 1st, 1963, Malcolm was set to give a lecture. The press misinterpreted what Malcolm said as him being happy that JFK had been killed, but that's not what he meant. What he meant was JFK being killed was a result of the political climate of hate. There was so much hate going around, especially towards Black Americans, that eventually it was going to come back. You can't give out hate without getting it back. That's what he meant. Elijah knew this and he was infuriated. He was like, I told you not to say anything about JFK. I strictly forbid it. And you did it anyway. You're grounded. Elijah places Malcolm on a 90-day suspension and forbids him from speaking on behalf of the NOI. The FBI goes to him during this time and they try to get him to become an informant for them. After the 90 days is over, Malcolm doesn't hear anything from Elijah Muhammad or any of the members. He's noticed that they're kind of like ignoring him, avoiding him. So he realizes that he's not gonna come back. On March 8th, 1964, Malcolm announces that he's leaving the NOI and starting his own organization and mosque separate from Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm's popularity was continuing to increase and Elijah hated this. The NOI had its own newspaper publication that all of the members would read, so they began writing smear campaigns against Malcolm and trying to tarnish his reputation. When Malcolm learns about this, he retaliates by telling everyone Elijah Muhammad's business. He tells everyone that Elijah Muhammad has fathered children out of wedlock and that some of them were very young. They were underage. Elijah, of course, didn't like that Malcolm was airing all his dirt out, so he retaliates by having Malcolm and his family evicted from their family home. Malcolm opens a case to fight for his home because he deserved his home, right? Like, he earned it. Then he and his family began receiving death threats. They were receiving death threats via the phone or letters or whatever. It was very scary. Malcolm reports the death threats that he and his family are getting, and this infuriates members of the NOI. Meanwhile, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI are still listening to both sides, and they have recorded evidence of Elijah Muhammad insinuating that Malcolm X should die. They had so much evidence that legally they were required to notify Malcolm X that there was a threat to his life. They legally had to protect him as a citizen. But Malcolm refuses protection from the FBI because he doesn't trust them. He knows that they also want him dead. Like, the FBI knew that Malcolm X would refuse their help because they knew he was smarter than that, but they still had to have record of them offering in case. On February 14th, 1965, a day before Malcolm was supposed to appear in court to fight for his house, a firebomb was thrown through his front window while he and his family were inside and literally exploded his house, like set his house on fire. Malcolm and his family had nowhere to go after their house was burned down. He also wasn't doing well financially because all of his money was tied in with the NOIs. In the weeks leading up to Malcolm's death, everyone who was around him said that he pretty much knew he was going to die and he just accepted it. He knew that there was nothing that could stop it. But he continued working and showing up to public lectures and gatherings. He was very brave, actually. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm was scheduled to speak at the Audubon Ballroom in New York City. And normally for a venue this size and with someone like Malcolm's popularity, the NYPD would typically send 20 police officers to do security. However, for this event, they only sent 2. Malcolm gets on stage and starts speaking, and shortly after he began, 3 men rush the stage shouting, and one of them pulls off a sawed-off shotgun and shoots Malcolm, where he would slowly bleed out on the stage. His bodyguards were able to capture one of the men, however the other 2 got away. They had one of the guys who was actually involved, and then the other 2 were just guys who fit the description, even though the description was very vague. It's commonly known that the men who were arrested and charged for Malcolm's murder didn't actually do it, but the police didn't care on actually investigating it. The 2 guys who were innocent spent 20 years in prison for his murder. Martin Luther King Jr. and his secret life. The FBI starts listening, thinking that they're going to hear Martin and Stanley planning some communist takeover, but what they hear instead is Martin talking about his extramarital affairs. In 1964, Martin was announced as the recipient for the Nobel Peace Prize. He's now being recognized as a symbol of peace and justice all over the world for his nonviolent strategy and demonstrations in America. When J. Edgar Hoover learns that Martin Luther King will be receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, he is infuriated. He would publicly attack Martin in the media more than once. He would make it known to the world that he did not like Martin Luther King Jr. But instead of retaliating against J. Edgar Hoover and, saying something back, he instead says that the FBI should be more focused on solving the crimes that are being perpetrated against Black people. Clarence Jones, who again is Martin's speechwriter and lawyer, has suspicions that the FBI might be listening in to their conversations, and he brings this up to Martin multiple times. In early 1965, Martin realizes that Clarence is right. The FBI is listening to their phone calls, and they're doing a lot more than that. Martin receives an anonymous letter sent to his family home, and included with the letter is an audio tape. She calls Martin, who's at his office, and tells him, hey, somebody just sent this weird tape of 2 people having what is this? Can you come get this? So Martin goes home and reads the letter, and the letter basically says, you're a terrible person, you're an imbecile, and you're going to be exposed if you don't do what needs to be done, implying that Martin should kill himself. Receiving this tape caused a lot of problems in their marriage, of course. Martin had suspected that the FBI's were behind sending the tape and the letter, but he couldn't prove it. However, later we would confirm that it was the FBI who sent it because they kept a copy of it. Fortunately for him, no one published the story of his misconduct. It just never came out. I'm not sure why that is, but it never came out. But the anxiety that it would come out never left, and he now knew that the FBI was following him everywhere, so it made him a little paranoid. Martin was not going to let this stop him from fighting for equality. He continued the fight. In 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson, who is now the president, signs the Voting Rights Act, which makes it illegal to discriminate against anyone who's trying to vote. This was a huge win for the civil rights movement and for Martin Luther King, and it formed a political alliance between Martin Luther King Jr. and the White House. Martin had hoped that this new political alliance would help with some of the initiatives he wanted to get passed. He had now shifted his focus from solely getting equality for Black Americans to fighting poverty in America for everyone. In 1966, 1967, Martin decided to speak out against the Vietnam War. Martin knew that speaking out against the war would risk his relationship with Lyndon B. Johnson and his White House administration. He also received a lot of criticism from other civil rights leaders. They felt he was making a mistake by ruining his relationship with the White House to speak on what he felt was right. Lyndon B. Johnson and the White House had declared Martin Luther King an enemy after this. In late 1967, Martin had become very pessimistic that the American government would ever do anything to really get equality for Black Americans or to solve the poverty issue. So instead of continuing to wait for the government to do something, he announces that he's planning this campaign called the Poor People's Campaign, in which he's going to take all of the nation's poor, or anyone who wants to come, all races, and they're going to go to Washington and they're going to stand outside and wait until somebody does something. This was going to be a multiracial working class campaign. So he was trying to unify all of the races and all of the impoverished people in the country and join together to get something done about it. He began advocating for things like job guarantees, living wages, universal health care, shifting the focus from civil rights to economic equality, and not just for Black Americans, for everyone. He wanted to help everyone. He wanted a redistribution of the wealth. And he was already really famous at this point. Like, he could have taken his money and gone, but he genuinely wanted to do what was right, which is very noble. So when they learn what Martin is planning, of course they start panicking because they know Martin has enough influence to actually pull this off. Lyndon B. Johnson was already aware of the fact that the FBI was stalking Martin, so he asked J. Edgar Hoover to put together something that's going to stop Martin for good. So the FBI begins drafting this document in which they put together all of the shady things that they found about Martin Luther King Jr., and this is in the hopes of getting him indicted. The most shocking claim that they put in this document is that Martin may have been an accomplice to a assault, like he was a witness to the assault. Many of the historians who have reviewed this document don't necessarily believe this happened because of how much the FBI hated him and they were literally trying to take him down. Evidence of this in the audio tapes that they have, the recorded audio tapes of this happening, allegedly, those are all locked away and won't be available until 2027. So we can't actually say that this happened until we have more evidence. So the FBI is drafting this document, and the document was dated 3 weeks before Martin Luther King was assassinated. On April 4th, 1968, Martin is killed at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, and the nation is devastated. The FBI is eventually pressured into finding out who killed Martin Luther King Jr. because initially they didn't want to do it. After the reputation of the FBI was at stake, J. Edgar Hoover took it seriously and they launched this full investigation on who killed Martin Luther King Jr. Eventually they find the assassin, a man named James Earl Ray, and apparently he had all of these weapons with him and he had multiple passports and he was trying to leave the country when they found him. Those who were close to Martin were very skeptical of the FBI's investigation because they knew that Martin was being followed 24/7, and the FBI admits this. They admitted that they were surveying him all of the time. They were at all of the hotels he was at. So how did they not know this was happening? How were they not there? I do believe that if the FBI hadn't been so gross and unethical that we wouldn't have any of this information, like it just wouldn't be any of our business. But now that we do kind of have to look at him as a whole person. If anything, I've just learned that you shouldn't idolize anyone. No one's perfect. Everyone's going to disappoint you. Literally everyone. Human beings are disappointing.